Welcome, scholars, again to another presentation in the series in the course of History of the Christian Church, Part 1. Again, may He, the Ancient of Days, the great God, enable us to penetrate into His wisdom of leading the church in history. We are coming close to the end of the period 313 to 590 AD. And we are about to engage or to learn one of my most favorite topics in the history of the Christian church, the athletes of God. These athletes of God, as they were known, actually describe men who decided to take Christianity or Christian practices to another level. By another level, I just mean they did not necessarily start doing things that were, give up things that were evil, no. But they gave up good things, things that are approved by God, but gave up those things in order to just lead and live a life of special dedication to God. I guess this is why this appeals to me very much, because when I reflect over what others have done as they have served God, this section of history touches me. This is the introduction of the monastic life, the monasticism. Monasticism, from the word monos, which is by definition alone, is the concept of choosing to be alone or choosing to do certain things as a way of a life of how you want to be used by God or to experience God. A life of monasticism or living alone or a life of meditation, whatever you want to call it, that these athletes of God experienced is actually one that they derived from scriptures. For example, the story in Judges chapter 13 narrates the Nazarene vows that Samson experienced and lived under. The Nazarene vows excluded use of wine, not because wine was not used by those who were followers of Yahweh, but he was set aside and he lived a life of excluding certain practices, even though they were good, in order to just be a vessel to be used by God in a unique way. And so monasticism drew examples from such kind of vows. Remember, a monastic life or a life of monos, being alone with God, had vows of choosing to say, I am choosing this lifestyle. Another example that was given was that of Elijah living alone in 1 Kings chapter 17, when the entire kingdom of Israel under evil leaders leading God's people, Elijah went and lived for 3 years alone, hiding somewhere and just praying by faith, praying, thinking about God's people who are back home being led by evil kings, and praying and saying, God, please, will you let your people continue in evil? Until you remember it climaxed to that time when they went to the mountain And after 3 years of living alone, Elijah came to the public. So hermits, that's people who chose to just be alone. This is the monos concept. They used this to say, you know, there are examples in the Bible of people who chose to go and live alone and just be with God. They cite also Matthew chapter 4 when Jesus Christ was laid in the wilderness for 40 days. And during those 40 days, 40 nights, we are told he did not eat. He fasted. You realize by this, as I describe these scholars, that we're not talking about people choosing to depart from sin. Samson is not sinning and so saying, I'm giving up wine because it's a sin. Elijah is not sinning by saying, I'm giving up the city because living in the city is a sin. Jesus is not sinning by going into the wilderness and living for 40 days and 40 nights fasting. But he chooses to go and spend those days as a means of strengthening his calling, preparing for his calling into ministry, preparing for his public service, seeking God's empowerment, seeking a clearer vision of God. I guess the point here is there is such a thing that these the athletes of God got from Scripture about being alone, just being alone to be with God. And they gave Jesus as an example. They also used John the Baptist. In Mark 1:1-4, the Bible says he came from the wilderness to preach. It says he lived in the wilderness and was eating locusts, and describes his clothing. I guess if you look at John, he chose an ascetic life of simplicity. His dress was simple. He lived in the wilderness or in the desert and would just preach from there, and people would flock to him to listen to him. And what was he doing living there? He was there meditating with God, praying to God, seeking a clearer purpose for his life, seeking God to just use him to the fullest. He deprived himself of things like being with his parents and getting married and all the social good things that are acceptable in the eyes of the world. But he chose to be alone. And they use that as an example. The athletes of God use the example of Christ's teaching, for example, in Mark chapter 10, verse 21, when he says, if you want to be perfect, go sell your riches, give to the poor, then follow me. So they took it to another level and simply said, he said it. And so you find these people, some of them who were wealthy people, with inherited wealth or wealth they had made, come to an encounter with God and simply decide to say, I am giving up my wealth, I'll sell my wealth, I'll give to the poor, and I'll go and live alone out in the wilderness. I'll just go live, I'll be alone with God. And they use that now. You know, there's nothing wrong with having wealth. No. As a matter of fact, wealth has been used to further the gospel ministry. As a matter of fact, even some of these people, as we will learn, ended up actually being in a position in which they needed someone's help for their day-to-day living. But they took Christianity, they took Christian practice to another level. Let me come to the last one. They looked at Paul's teachings on celibacy, when Paul simply says we are living in the last days, and if you don't want to be disturbed from being or having a focused life of complete dedication to God without parental responsibility and partnership responsibility, you live a life of celibacy. Do not marry. Be alone. So they took that. Now, scholars, you get this point to start with. There is absolutely nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong in getting married, having a family, raising a family, enjoying life, as it were, being with your wife, one from your youth, and enjoying the entire package that comes with having a wife. But the athletes of God would choose to give up all this. Maybe the word give up describes it. They gave up the things that were not wrong in order to be on a different level of commitment, experience with God. This is what gave the biblical background to monasticism, the practice of being alone with God, for God. Spiritual life by meditation and ascetic acts. Retirement from the world so that a person can engage in a spiritual life through meditation and ascetic acts. Causes of monasticism. What agitated people to come to this point? There are several factors that historians recognize, and I will share some of those. One, increased moral deterioration as a result of the influx of barbarians, many of whom diluted Christianity by bringing in their semi-pagan practices. You remember we had talked about pagans, the barbarians who got converted. The church all of a sudden was no longer hundreds of people, it became thousands, probably millions of people. And the period was too short for them to have learned what it meant to be a child of God. And so the church became deteriorated in its morals. And so because of this, the expression, if you can't change them, join them, or just leave them. So the athletes of God chose to leave, go be alone. Monastic life offered a more individual approach to God than the formal corporate worship of the time. You go to church, and people just take church as usual, church, regular business. But a monastic life kind of made religion very personal. Not the expression, I'm making this personal. It made it very personal. And as such, a person felt a certain sense of commitment to God outside of the formal corporate worship of the time. In order to overcome the flesh, and this is an argument mainly coming from the eastern side of the church. The eastern side, you remember, will be referring to Athens and the Antiochs, the area where philosophy was highly a factor in influencing them. You remember Gnosticism, the concept that says flesh is evil and the spirit is good. So it was felt in order to overcome the flesh, which was viewed as evil, people went to engage in meditation and ascetic acts as a means of getting to be more spiritual. This people would do by separating from society and even from marriage in order to escape flesh corruptions. Now, you have to remember, this is not a theology class necessarily, and you might develop a theology of saying, now this is wrong. What they did is wrong. Whether what they did was, I don't even think it's wrong, but the motives may have been wrong. But whatever they did, history reports reasons that caused monasticism. People chose to be separated from society, even from marriage, in order to escape the corruption of the flesh. Whether that happened or not is another story, but they did. Also, escaping from harsh realities and the moral contamination of the times in public society. You know, sometimes life can be very harsh. Waking in the morning, you wake up, you're just busy. You have no time for contemplation, for meditation. And obviously the climate of Egypt, which was warm, and the caves along the Nile rivers provided a conducive climate for survival. These people we are talking about, they just did not leave society to go and live into some nice cabin outside in some the cabins. They lived in caves. They found a cave along the Nile's river, got themselves there, began living there, and led a life there. These are some of the causes for monasticism. Monasticism was actually practiced separately. There was the natural ascetic life. There was also another extreme. In the natural ascetic of life, it actually just embraced things that you would find a basis for in scripture: abstinence from sex or marriage, simple living, just living a life of begging. The Bible doesn't encourage begging, but in history, people gave up what they had to make themselves so simple that sometimes they had to beg. A life of fasting, the Bible teaches fasting, humility, compassion, patience, and prayer. The other kind of monastic, which was unnatural, that was practiced, was sometimes people just going way in the wilderness and they give up everything that is human. They start eating grass. They start living in manners that are actually hurting the body, just excruciating pain, that kind. So you'll find people like the great church fathers, Origen and Cyprian, Tertullian, and Jerome. These all did not speak against the concept of monasticism, going alone for meditation, for prayers. As a matter of fact, these are some of the men who strongly engaged actually in that. Some even advocated for a life of celibacy. Now, let's come to examples of monastic leaders, people who led out in monasticism. Again, there are those from the eastern side of the church and those from the western side of the church. When you go to those in the eastern side, you will find names such as St. Anthony, who lived from 250 to 356. You will find Pachomas, Basil of Caesarea. In the western side, you'd find Athanasius, Benedict of Nicaea. Let's take now each of these. St. Anthony. St. Anthony is regarded as founder of monasticism. At the age of 20, he sold his wealth and retired to a solitary cave to live a life of meditation. 13 years he stayed out in the caves at first, then he came into society, but again he went back for 20 years. Now, look at how old this man was by the time he died. 105. I would encourage you scholars to spend time reading, writing if you can, about St. Anthony. Because St. Anthony, his experience in the wilderness became so valuable to people that he wrote what has been read as the wisdom of St. Anthony. His last 20 years, actually, it is believed, when he lived into this little small house-like, he stayed inside there. Kind people would bring him food, and when they bring him food, they would ask him questions that demanded wisdom. And he gave them wisdom that he got from God. St. Anthony remains to this day as the founder and a great person in the monastic movement, in the athletes of God. Pachomas, born 292, died 346. Pachomas was a discharged soldier who, after living for 12 years as a hermit, which is as a person alone, monos person, organized the first monastery about 320 at Tabenis on the banks of Niles. He had over 7,000 followers. This man wrote what was read as the Ascetica, how to live an ascetic life. Again, you noticed one of the interesting things about these men is that when they took up to this kind of life, they produced things that were helpful. They wrote and they taught and they experienced things of God. And we will see as we go on. The other one was Basil of Caesarea. Basil of Caesarea did much to popularize common type of monastic organization, which is in a way separate from the other kind of monasticism we've talked about. You know, there was those who lived by themselves, and there was also the kind of monasticism that was called Cenobite monasticism. Cenobite monasticism made its first appearance in Egypt. And Pachomius was, and is attributed to among those who actually chose that instead of just being alone, he could actually accept others to come and live with him, but who will practice the things that he was practicing. And this is the difference between the monastic life of a single person, of being alone, to Cenobite monasticism. He was an educated man, educated in Athens and Constantinople. At the age of 27, gave up worldly advancement for the ascetic life. He commanded monks who came to live with him to engage in work, in prayers, in the study of scripture, and in the performance of good deeds. Again, you know, scholars capture this. These are men who have come out of the church usual life of just going to church and coming back, going to church and coming back. They want to engage in something more than that. They want to engage in working to produce and feed the poor. They want to engage in prayer life. They want to read the Bible at a certain different level and to perform good deeds of charity. These three men we've covered, some of the great names from the eastern side. That's how come you see Athens here or Constantinople as people who laid out in the monastic life. We now come to those in the western side. And Athanasius, from 296 to 373, is another one who laid out. This man introduced monasticism in the West. He learned it from St. Anthony and wrote about St. Anthony's history. Much of what we have about St. Anthony's history is learned from what Athanasius wrote about him. Remember, Athanasius is known as a great writer in history, and he wrote about St. Anthony. He popularized in the West monasticism. It's actually believed that traditionally he is credited with having introduced monasticism in the West during one of his periodic exiles from Constantinople. So pilgrims from Palestine came in contact with monasticism and were attracted to it. Martin of Tours, Jerome, Augustine, and Ambrose, some of the great theologians we've already covered, wrote in favor of monasticism and even helped popularize it within the Roman Empire. Jerome, as a matter of fact, his writings on asceticism ranked next to the Bible and Benedict's rule in the medieval monk library. Again, these are the great men that were used. To come to Benedict of Nicaea, 480 to 543, the greatest leader of monasticism in the West, founder of monasteries of Monte Cassino, which actually survived until World War II. He too followed a Cenobite monastic life. Pope Gregory, you remember Pope Gregory, as we will learn about him in the lessons to come, became Pope in 590. Pope Gregory wrote about this great man. The Benedict rule became one of the important literature to read and to study in the churches that followed. What are the contributions of monasticism to the Christian movement, to the church? And you know, I say this so that, and I think it's very good for us to learn this, because many times, and especially after the Reformation by Martin Luther, those people who came and expounded righteousness by faith cast a dark shadow on monasticism and almost labeled it as salvation by works and all of that, when in actuality, these men were not necessarily seeking ascetic life as a means of salvation, as much as they were actually doing this for purposes of dedicating their lives to what? To a ministry for God. So some of the contributions of monasticism included, they became the monks who became missionaries of the medieval church. So you see, again, from these people, from the monks who went out for an ascetic life, they became the missionaries who went out during the medieval church. They developed practices or hobbies or actually skills in farming as they lived out in the country, techniques that were shared with the society. They helped keep scholarship alive, especially during the Dark Ages between 500 to 1000. Let me say this. These people, while living in monasteries, they became the custodian of some of the most important manuscripts in the development of the church and the writings of the church fathers. They kept them, they reread them, understood them, and passed them on to other believers during the Dark Ages. This is the time also, in contribution, they provided a refuge for the outcasts in society who needed help. There are always people in society who have no homes, and they found their homes in monasteries. And then those who were tired of worldliness and found refuge in monastic life would come to monasteries. People like great leaders like Gregory VII actually is an example of that. As I close this presentation, I'd like to say, like all good things, the enemy can capitalize on them. There is a dark side to monasticism. That dark side is that sometimes those great, well-talented men spent their lives out in isolation and failed to make an impact to people in society. So great talent was wasted. And then some of them began making beliefs about things like celibacy and made it almost like it's a test of faith. In other words, they were tempted to look down upon those who remained in regular standing of the church out there as people who have not yet reached certain levels of commitment. But these are some of the things that come with that. As a scholar, as a student of history, my hope and prayer is that you will not go away without reflecting on what these great men did. Great men like St. Anthony, great men like Benedict, great men like Athanasius, men who led a movement, monasticism, which became a strong pillar to the life of the church thereafter. I hope you will pick one or two lessons, and who knows what the Lord may make out of you. Until we meet for another class, blessings and God be with you. Thank you.